Okay, so task 2 steps up the complexity a little bit. We've made our 3 HTML prototypes, and in this task what we're going to do is now concentrate on addMovie.html. And basically, because we've got user input, we're going to perform some validation tasks and try to provide the user with some feedback if they don't provide the right expected data. Okay, so there's sort of two parts to this. The first part is basically just to validate the form. And all this is going to have to do is write a function which checks the user has actually supplied data into each of the fields of the form. Okay, and if they do, this function should return true and allow the form data to be submitted. Otherwise, if there's any problem in any of the fields, it should return false. Okay, so this is addMovie.html. So we've already created our form. What we want to do now is, within our code, make a few changes to the original addMovie.html. I should note I've moved into task 2 folder of the supplied code. What I do is I copy the code from each folder into the next one, just so you've got a record. Okay, so we're in addMovie.html, and we've made a couple of changes. So first change we've made is linked a couple of scripts into this HTML file. So the first one is the jQuery library. I'll be using that in the second part of this task. And the main focus of interest will be in this validate.js. This is my own script which I've included to carry out the validation functionality. Okay, the only other change is within the form tag. So now we want to, whenever the user attempts to submit this form, what we want to do is run a validation function that we have written and return the value whether it's true or false. So this will control whether the form submits or not. So we have a function named validateForm, and we're just going to pass a reference to this form. This means that when this function gets called, we have a reference to this specific form. Okay, and the validateForm function is specified within the validate.js file. So if we move into that, okay, here's our validateForm function. Okay, and we can see the reference to the form that's going to be passed in. This is a fairly straightforward and basic way to approach this problem. It's not particularly sophisticated, but it illustrates the point. So all we're going to do is set up one large block of if-else statements, and in each of them we're going to, from the form that was passed in, we're going to look for a named form element. So if we just quickly return to our form, we can see we gave each of the form elements a name. So this creates the linkage between the form and then when we're processing it, when that data has been filled in. Okay, so that's where the dot title is coming from. So we're saying get the title field from this form and then look at the value that's been passed in. Okay. And the test is quite simple. We're just using an equality test and to an empty string. So we're saying basically if the form title value is empty, return false. The only thing I should say about the equals, we're using the equality operator, which is normally 2 equal signs, but within JavaScript you can test the equality plus the type of data, and it's a more robust test. Okay, so the same pattern repeats for the synopsis, genre, release, score, and poster, each time returning false. Should any of these tests be true in the block, in the expression here, this function instantly returns false. It breaks, it doesn't evaluate any more statements. If all of these pass, that is, that there is some data in each of these not equal to an empty string, then the very last return fires, which is return true, which lets the form be submitted. Okay, so let's look at that in the browser. Okay, so if I try to submit the form with no data at all, okay, there's no feedback given here, but nothing's actually happening. If I type in data in all of the fields, don't really worry about what type of data I type in, and I try to submit, okay, we can see that that actually did submit that time. The form has been cleared, it's essentially reloaded the page again. But a nice little hint of what's happened, if you look at the URL, you can see that not only have we loaded add-movie.html again, we've now added some extra parameters to the URL string, indicating that the get HTTP protocol was called by default. Okay. There's other ways to achieve that, but that's one straightforward way. The second part here is to actually provide some visual feedback. Okay, so we want to build on the validate form function, but this time we want to be able to show the user that if they've missed some data, then we should be able to highlight a field in some way using CSS that will kind of draw their attention to that and allow them to correct it. So in this, I just need to bring up my function. For this function, I decided to use jQuery. Again, you could do it just using plain JavaScript, and you could have completed the previous task using jQuery as well. The task did say you could use both, but in this case, it's a bit easier to use JavaScript, jQuery and JavaScript. Okay, so as long comment to start with here, which kind of explains the different steps. This is a bit more difficult to read, but if we go through it line by line, it should hopefully make sense. Again, we're passing the form in with this function. Okay, so we're saying the first line here is maybe not too familiar. What we're saying is we're creating a flag that's saying it's just a simple Boolean variable that says is valid true. So we're starting off with the presumption the form is true. And in the following code, what's going to happen is try to disprove that and lower that flag to say false. And then the final line of code will return that flag, whether it's been kept to the value true or returned false. Okay, so this is where things probably get a little bit complicated, but this sort of illustrates the types of tricks you can do with jQuery. You can basically do quite a lot of actions in a short amount of code. The first thing we do is we've got a select, and we're selecting form fields. And we can see it's a class. We've got the dot there, and you'll hopefully remember that we have dot form field in the CSS, and each of the field elements has a form field. Okay, so this select function will match all of them. Then the first thing it's going to do is it's going to apply a function called, you can remove or add CSS classes. So we're going to use the remove class function, and we're going to tell it to remove the highlight red class. This might seem a little unusual, but what you have to think about here is throughout the execution and repeated attempts to submit this form, you may end up adding red highlights to a form element. Okay, and the class highlight red, we go back to our CSS, we can see it's just a very simple class that whatever has this class will get a red border. Nothing too complicated there. Okay, so the first thing we do is remove the class of each of those so they don't have a red border. And then we use the each method to iterate across all of the matched form fields. Again, we can see we're condensing a lot of functionality into one line. Okay, and the behavior of this each function is given by this anonymous function, which will simply use a reference to the current field element, so whichever, it'll iterate through each of the collection of form fields that were matched. So the form has 7 form fields, so it will go through 7 times. This is just a shorthand, so we don't have to do the match, the select again. And then we use the value function to get the value of that form field. And this is exactly the same as above, doing the same thing. except this time we're not directly referencing each of the form elements. The test is exactly the same, equality plus type, and should the field be empty, we then, again referencing the thing that's already under inspection, we can then use the add class function, highlight red, and flip our flag up here to be false, saying, okay, we've found one of the form fields which is false. So if I just quickly demonstrate that, I need to update my validation function here. Okay, just save my JavaScript, and if we go into the browser, just reload. Okay, so if I try to type in some data, but if I don't complete the entire form, I submit, what happens now is all the fields that have not got any information are highlighted. Okay, so that's quite nice. If I fill another one in, okay, we can see that it updates. And we just quickly go back to the code, the jQuery. That's the whole point of removing the class, because each time we remove that just in case the user has already provided some data. Okay, and finally the form submits, and we can see up there the extra parameters have been filled in and the form has been cleared. Okay, and that completes task 2.